Good afternoon and welcome to the Future of Finance. This afternoon we will discuss whether to go back to the office or stay at home. I shall now pass you over to Dominic Hobson and our panel. Thank you.
Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar, Time to Decide, Back to the Office or Stay at Home. I'm Dominic Hobson, co-founder of Future of Finance, and I'm delighted to moderate our discussion this afternoon. Now, the commercial real estate markets are massive. The value of commercial real estate in the United States in 2018, that's the latest figure we have, well before the pandemic struck, was 16 trillion US dollars. The equivalent figure for the United Kingdom that year was 951 billion pounds. Now, that's more than 10% of the net wealth of both countries. And city centre office space accounts for a good chunk of that value. The United States, pre-pandemic, more than 60 million people went to the office every day. So if tenants find they need less office space, that's potentially not a hiccup, it's an earthquake. And COVID-19 has certainly put remote working to the ultimate test. And there is a growing body of evidence from surveys such as the Leesman Index, as well as anecdotal evidence that a majority of employees do not want to go back to things the way they were before. And if employers choose not to listen to that, and some, such as the CEOs of Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, are saying explicitly that they want people back in the office, there are risks to be managed. When Yahoo cancelled remote working back in 2013 on grounds employees needed to collaborate face-to-face in the office, it was a major factor behind the exit of fully 1/3 of employees the following year. And that, of course, is the trouble with paid work. It's work, and work is intrinsically disagreeable. And if employers can vote with payroll numbers, employees can vote with their feet. As always in corporate life, to adapt the classic text by the great Albert Hirschman, it's never voice, it's always loyalty or exit. Now, to help us understand how corporate real estate is preparing to navigate the Scylla of loyalty and the Charybdis of exit, I'm joined by 4 experts in the real estate markets. Brian Bartleby is the founder and CEO of PropLend, an FCA-regulated peer-to-peer lending platform for commercial real estate borrowers and lenders. Sam Hocking is co-founder and CRO at Vertis AI, a San Francisco-based business that provides data analytics services to decision makers in commercial real estate and workforce and workplace management and planning. Shravan Sood is CEO of Global Alpha, a privately owned property investment vehicle that invests in prime urban real estate. He was formerly managing director, broker-dealer services at the Bank of New York Mellon. Frank Spadafora is former head of investor services technology at Cushman & Wakefield, who now provides strategic advisory on digital transformation, emerging technologies, and product development to participants across the global commercial real estate community. Now, in addition to our panelists, we do, of course, also have you, our audience. We want your questions, we want your comments, so do please send them. Keep sending them throughout our discussion using the Q&A or chat functionality at the bottom of your Zoom screens. We will not be saving them up to the end, but we'll answer them as we go along, so you can be, if you want to be, an integral part of this discussion right from the start. And I think I speak for all of us when I say we'll be very disappointed if some of you at least don't take that opportunity. I'm going to begin by asking whether the pandemic marks a turning point in how and where we work. Could we have the first slide, please? And I'd like to thank Shravan for drawing my attention to this slide, which was prepared by McKinsey. McKinsey looked at 2,000 activities across 800 occupations to test whether a physical presence at work was actually necessary. And it showed, or at least they found, that the more advanced your economy, the greater the scope for remote working. In the UK, nearly half of employees could work from home at least 1 day and up to 5 days a week. In Germany, France, the US, and Japan, around 40% can. When you get to India or China, only 20% are able to work remotely, or so says McKinsey. And certainly the evidence of the pandemic is that we can get an awful lot done, indeed more apparently in the same time. In other words, we've been able to raise our productivity without going to the office. The Leesman Index, which I referred to earlier, which is based in its latest version on more than 180,000 responses from individuals working for more than 1,400 organizations, it finds 83% of employees reckon they're working more productively from home, 72% of them think home working provides a better life-work balance, and 64% of them still feel connected to colleagues despite working from home. But then, of course, they would say that, wouldn't they? But I think employees are not the only ones talking their own book in this case. Right now, we're hearing an awful lot from some very obviously self-interested parties, namely senior managers, and real estate owners, agents, and managers about how the office is the key to creativity, teamwork, training, innovation, and of course, that most fantastic unicorn of them all, the corporate culture. We also hear how real estate landlords and developers are planning to make the office a more attractive place for employees to go to. They're going to provide juice bars, on-site health checks, yoga rooms, table football sets, technology support, and more meeting rooms with beanbags, somewhat in the mode of Silicon Valley or WeWork. My question for our panelists is, how seriously should we take the views of the Back to the Office Brigade? After all, before the pandemic, the worry was the office was actually killing creativity. And why do they need to install a juice bar and a yoga mat if the office was already the key to creativity, innovation, teamwork, training, and that famous corporate culture? Isn't the truth that managers simply don't trust their workers to do any work at all if they're not in the office? Isn't the office, even with a juice bar and a yoga mat, in practice a form of strict industrial discipline? In other words, what employees are being told is read the memo and be there, or we won't pay you or promote you. Frank, is that a fair characterization of the current state of the debate about going back to the office?
Yes, I think so. And obviously, I think we're going to hear a bias, an inherent bias for those that have skin in the game. We have occupiers that have traditionally executed long-term leases and have a significant portion of their operating budget dedicated to that leasing space. And then you also have landlords who have underwritten those long-term leases, right, in debt and equity structuring and in development. So obviously, I think we're going to hear a bias. Independent of that bias, I think there are some elements that you've raised about work culture, right, and collaboration that are more challenging remote. When you talk about training, you talk about teamwork and collaboration. Those things do have challenges if you're virtual only. However, I think the challenge is that the yardstick is moving. The measurements are moving. And what I mean by that is that the old yardstick utilization of access card swipes or workstation occupancy rates, right? That's the old yardstick. I think the definitions of creativity and experience for the workforce are shifting. So I think the owners, occupiers are going to need to those new definitions of what is a collaborative workforce, what does workforce deem as creativity and connection in the space. So I think the metrics are shifting, and I think owners and occupiers are going to need to shift with those metrics.
Mm-hmm. Shravan, I was thinking that we've been talking in corporate life about teams and flat hierarchies for many years now, but most offices I visit actually reflect the hierarchical structure of the organization. There's a lot more space for the senior executives. They have separate dining rooms, separate lavatories. They're probably driven to work by a chauffeur rather than having a long commute on a train. And so it's a bit easier for them to enthuse about going back to the office. It means something very different for a senior executive, what it does for an employee. So do you think the office needs to become a more egalitarian or democratic place than it is today?
Whether it should and whether it is, I guess, two slightly different questions. I think what the McKinsey report that where you flagged up this slide has shown is that what we're looking at here is an acceleration of a trend that was already very much in place. I think, the work-life balance, this is a syndrome, which you can associate very clearly with developed versus developing markets. And the slide that's up on the screen just reinforces that point, which is that employees, it's kind of a Maslow's hierarchy type of syndrome. They value money less and quality of life more as society develops. And there's almost a perfect correlation between economic development and the need for work-life balance. So I think, in essence, there has been this sudden seismic shift because of COVID, but the trend was already very clear. And I think, part of that trend is also a flattening of the corporate hierarchy. To your point, when I started out and dinosaurs were roaming the earth in the corporate world, it was extremely hierarchical. And absolutely, there was a C-suite and there were separate toilets and separate, the corner office for the boss and so on, and open plan for everyone else. And, that has been progressively whittled away and whittled away. And it's already become, even before COVID, it had certainly become a lot more egalitarian, meritocratic, and less old school time. So this is all part of a continuum. And all that COVID has done is, made everything move a lot faster. And things that perhaps would have taken decades to develop, like, everyone working from home, I think we would have gotten there eventually anyway. The real question, I think, is that a temporary blip and life will go back to normal, as you mentioned at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, or is this here to stay? That's the real question.
Yeah, well, we've got some data from our friends at Aon, which I'm going to share with you on that very question in a minute. But I'd first like to bring Brian and Sam into the conversation. Brian, you first. You're lending to the commercial real estate sector. You've just heard the evidence, which I produced, and which both the other speakers have confirmed, that there is this, not reluctance, but people will not be rushing back to the office. They feel they've learned something from this experience, and therefore the real estate industry is going to have to change. How are you building that into your credit judgments and your real estate lending risk management criteria, if you like?
Sure. I mean, just sort of quite an interesting point on what you were talking about. There's a hierarchical of the sort of C-suite being in the corner office, etc. In actual fact, in a way, you've got to think about it. It's a hugely emotive topic. There are sort of loads of discussions of this on LinkedIn day in, day out, to back the office not. And I think every company has to make their own decision based on what type of company they are, who their employees are. You've got employees who are very lucky, maybe live. So we're based in London, maybe they're outside London, they've got a house, they've got room to have a separate office in their home, so they feel as if they're actually getting out of their home and almost going to work, whereas there are other employees who are single, living in a one-bed flat, and they pretty much crawl out of bed and go to the end of their bed and do their work at the end of their bed. So they're desperate to get back to the office. So I think you need to take a sort of bigger view on the thing. There isn't just one answer, one catch-all answer that will catch everyone. And then to come to specifically your question there, it is interesting because previously we would have probably looked at a 25-year lease to a high street retailer and gone, yeah, that's a pretty good lease. We're pretty comfortable with that. Now we definitely look at things differently. Anyone who's got a sort of private equity backer, we take a very different view on them at the moment. Especially because during the lockdown here, obviously the government put in place a rent moratorium, which meant that a landlord couldn't evict a tenant for non-payment of rent. Now, there's obviously been some tenants who have been forcibly closed down. They've been pubs, they've been restaurants, they've been hotels, etc. They haven't been able to earn any income. So obviously we've had to offer some sort of leniency on them making their interest payments. But there have also been many well-funded, well-capitalized companies who've traded through lockdown, the whole way through lockdown, and who've just refused to pay their landlords their rental income. You don't have to go too far on Google to try and find out who they are, but there's some pretty big names out there, and and that's just wrong. And generally they're big PE-backed entities, and the instructions coming down, I'm assuming from the top of the PE, is saying, look, just don't pay your rent. We'll work it out later. And just hoarding all the cash up. So we've definitely taken a bit of a view on what we do look at, what we don't look at. Commercial property is great. It's such a big asset class. Corner shops have done really well. Supermarkets have done well. Last mile delivery, logistics, all those things that everyone has suddenly relied on for the past 12, 18 months have suddenly done super well. But obviously high street retail, pubs, restaurants, high street retail probably will change in the long term. Pubs and restaurants will come back to that as they open up, and they are opening up now. So, they've seen a temporary blip where some sectors will see a slightly more ongoing long-term blip, or a seismic change, actually, not a blip, but a seismic change.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That's interesting. Sam, you're our data guy. What does the data say? Are investors and tenants, if not landlords, actually looking at setting up regional, local hub offices? Are they refurbishing their offices to put those yoga mats and juice bars into them? What's going on when you look at the data as to what's happening in the real estate industry? And I assume your perspective is a United States one, but do tell us if it's global.
Yeah, I would say my data at the moment is probably more US based. I think one thing that I'm seeing is kind of a bifurcation of kind of the East Coast versus the West Coast. So if you think about the West Coast, much more tech companies, and more of probably a different view around work and work-life balance. So I think that's a big difference. And this is why it would be surprising if you ever heard any of the tech firms come out strong or as strong as the big banks in New York. And I think that's one interesting thing. The second interesting thing, the data is the tech firms have started to open up their offices on the West Coast. And at the moment, not many people are going to the office. So I'll give you some statistics. One of our clients has 1,800 seats in San Francisco, and 20 people have come on a daily basis. They have a San Jose office, 400 people, and one person's coming. And that one person is the facilities manager. So I think they need to give it time to see how people, I think it's also a big difference about how people on the West Coast are treating the idea around COVID and spacing versus probably people in New York. I think this other idea around productivity, I mean, a lot of the clients that we're talking to say productivity to them is not the issue anymore, in the sense of, could you be more productive at home? Yes, maybe. Or could you be more productive at the office? Yes, maybe. I think what a lot of the workplace strategists are talking about now is really thinking about the office versus home work. And they believe, yes, you could be as productive as home as you can be at the office. And in some cases, you could probably be more productive at home than you can be in the office. But the difference at the office, they feel, is that's where you build relationships with your colleagues, you build trust, and you have these serendipitous moments with people that you wouldn't have remotely. So there's a belief that you would come back to work at least a couple of days a week, as the culture of trust and working together becomes, completely becomes important to that process. The last thing I'll say is one of the largest real estate investors in the world over the last 6 months to 9 months has bought about $2 billion of office space. So there is a belief that the companies will go back to work at some level. And I think some of the biggest investors, some might say it's a contrarian bet, but they're putting a lot of capital back into the office. And lastly, I would say the workplace strategists have had to try to figure out what will be different in the experience of going to work versus just working at home.
Yeah, well, I've got some data I'm going to share in a second, but just what we do, we've had a question, which is an important one, actually. One of our member of our audience asking, what's our view on the cyber threat as more people work from home? Frank, I'm sure you've got a view on that.
Yeah, Dominic, I think obviously we were dealing with those challenges prior to COVID, and now that's been accelerated like all other facets of remote work. So whenever you have a distributed workforce, these issues of security, information security are going to increase, right? So I think it's front of mind for a lot of the companies that we're working with and advising on their new hybrid workforce strategies is how can you implement that zero trust security across connectivity, whether you're remote, hybrid, or working in the office. So I think we're going to see an increase in the need for that for security accommodations given the distributed workforce.
Yeah, well, it's one of the data points I'm going to talk about in a minute is how companies actually need to work with employees to make sure they have the right kit to work, successfully from home. And in fact, I'd like to introduce that data because we've received some very interesting proprietary data points from our friends at Aon. Now, Aon's business, as many of you will know, is HR and HR data in particular. They've been running regular surveys of senior HR professionals ever since the pandemic began. 7 of them so far. And it's not just about back to office after the pandemic, but also about the long-term changes to address Shravan's point. Is this a blip or is this a permanent secular change? The data does address that question. Is this going to accelerate changes in working practices that were happening already, or was it the trigger for them? And I'd like just to share some of the findings of this latest survey with the panel and obviously with our audience. Wendy, could you give us the first slide? Now, as you can see from this slide, 44% of firms in the Aon survey expect the majority of their employees to start returning to the office in Q3 of this year. There's only 12% of them haven't actually set a date to do that. So we're on a timetable here for sure. Slide 3. Now, this shows us that 55% of firms expect between 3/4 and 100% of their workforce to be back in the office full or part-time. Now, that does importantly vary, as Sam was indicating, by industry. Only 32% of tech firms expect such a high proportion of people to be back in the office, but it's 55% of financial services firms, as I mentioned a minute ago, are actually looking to get most people back in the office. And in fact, in financial services, Aon tell me that they've already seen the majority of front office staff, that's the trading and sales people, back in the office already, especially in the US, but also increasingly in Europe. And in fact, 79% of financial services organizations are looking to return half or more of their workers to the workplace at some point. However, what that return will eventually look like is still somewhat up in the air, but 64% of them expect it to be teens somewhere, as you can see from the chart on the right-hand side, somewhere between 2 and 5 days a week. So it's the hybrid model which Frank was referring to. Now, slide 4, which asks really whether the long-term plan is to return to the status quo ante the pandemic. We have 77% of firms have a future of work task force already asking questions about this. So apparently they're not planning to go back to the pre-pandemic world. They're asking questions like, what does remote working, what's the impact of it on our organization? What opportunities does it give us? What impact will it have on our employees? And of course, can our managers operate effectively if a lot of people reporting to them are actually working remotely? Now, slide 5 addresses some of those questions. Are companies considering serious answers to the questions I've just put? And it seems that they are. You've got more than 60% of respondents either have or they're planning formally to assess which jobs, which roles that is, and which employees can actually perform remotely. Actually asking themselves the questions, who do we need in the office and what types of jobs do we need in the office? Now, to help them, Aon has actually created this remote ability model that helps companies pinpoint which roles need to return to the office and which might not need to return. And that model is built on questions like, do they need access to physical materials? Do they need to interact with colleagues? What Sam was saying about, it's where you swap ideas and get creative. Do they need to develop? For young people particularly, need to get some career experience, they need to get trained and so on. And another component in the model is the range of management responsibilities of the individual. What's their span of responsibilities? Can they do it working from their drawing room out of town? Now, slide 6 is the question which I always think is the most interesting and important here, is whether companies are actually offering employees a genuine choice of working from home or at the office. And it's this data tells us that, if, as I said a minute ago, 55% of the firms are expecting most of their employees to be back in the office by the 3rd quarter of this year, are employees really offering a genuine choice of working remotely or not? Now, that's financial services firms, not all firms. But the Aon data certainly shows that they're actually asking employees. 84% of them have actually asked or are planning to ask their employees to express a preference on remote working. But it's interesting that only 57% of financial services firms say the main driver of their back to the office plans is employee preference. So I think there's definitely a bifurcation here between the financial services industry and other types of company. Now, slide 7. What factors are driving your future of work policy? What the Aon survey data is telling us is that 95% of people, I made a joke about this earlier, but they say 95% of their respondents are saying the company culture is the most important consideration in creating a future work policy, which means that if your company thinks its culture means being in the office, and the Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan CEOs have said that it does, working remotely on a permanent basis can clearly be filed under fat chance. Now, slide 8, the long-term trends. Does your organization have a very clear definition of what the future of work is going to be like? Now, more encouragingly, I think, for employees who like to work remotely, 75% of the respondents to the survey say they either have or soon will have a policy in place for remote working. And we touched on this a minute ago when we talked about cybersecurity. This policy has to cover things like, do people have the right technology? what are their technology requirements if they're going to work from home? What can they charge for? Can they charge for the phone or the broadband or the travel? Can they go to a local or a hub office? One of the questions which I asked Sam a minute ago. And of course, most importantly of all, what does it mean in terms of compensation and benefits? To put it crudely, can you pay somebody less if they don't have to commute to the office anymore? And the last slide actually addresses that direct point. Can you pay remote workers less money? And the survey is the Aon survey data is more equivocal on this point, but 32% of respondents still say, that's 1/3 of them still say they either have or are planning to consider adjusting their pay differentials to match where people work from, based on considerations such as, you know, where the employee lives, where their nearest office, which they could go to is, what their national pay scales are, and how often they need to come to the office. Now, there's an awful lot of detail in the Aon service. I've seen the whole thing, and I can assure you there's a great deal more to this data than I've been able to convey in these few minutes. And I think it'd be very useful to any firm considering what to do about remote working post-pandemic. We can't do justice to it in just a few minutes here, but we do have, I think, some very useful insights here based on hard data from a survey of HR professionals, which I would summarize as follows. Most companies expect most employees to be back in the office at least 2 or 3 days a week by the end of this year. Yes, most companies are also considering the pros as well as the cons of working remotely. They're asking their employees what they think about it and what they need to make a success of it in terms of technology support, access to local offices, and travel expenses. In other words, I think what this data is telling us is that firms like having people in the office, but they're also definitely treating the pandemic as an opportunity to completely reshape how their employees work. And I think they'll be extremely pleased if it also cuts their payroll costs. Now, how stable that combination is, I guess only time will tell. Now, Shravan, I'm thinking here. You've listened to all that data, and as Brian said, there is no one size fits all here. You have to take companies are different, people are different. So are there some? Is there for a start? Is there a generational difference? You know, do baby boomers not like going to the office but have to go to the office to get trained? Do Generation Z, because they've been brought up with mobile phones, actually don't really care where they work from, be it the coffee shop or the end of their bed in their flat? But maybe a more important question here is, do you think people are prepared to take a pay cut? You made this point earlier about people, you know, the Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You said money doesn't matter that much as you get richer. Do you think people are actually willing to be paid less for going to the office less?
Firstly, I don't think there's one size fits all. What I think is clear is that this pandemic has successfully debunked the notion that people are less productive if they don't come to the office working from home. I think it's also debunked the efficiency question. You know, I think these have now become relatively uncontroversial points. People can be just as productive, if not more productive, when they save, you know, 2 or 3 hours of commute time every day. They feel happier because they're in a comfortable environment. And obviously there's an enormous saving of desk space on the part of companies, gas, heating, electricity, and so on. I think the answer is that what we're looking at is it's not a binary question. It's more a question of degree. The outcome is likely to be hybrid in all cases. So people are likely to have the option of working increasingly from home. And I suspect that had it not been for this pandemic, it would take a long, long time to get there. But now that it's been, you know, demonstrably, people can be highly productive working from home, and there are cost savings all around for employees as well as employers, I think this is likely to become the new normal. However, and this is a really important point, this is one of those things that you don't read about in textbooks. It's this sort of the big unspoken question, which is office politics. It is incredibly difficult to engage successfully in office politics remotely. That's the sort of thing that can only really be done face to face. And whether you like it or not, it's just the harsh reality of corporate life, having spent 26 years of my life in it, that, the C-suite is akin to a club. People tend to promote people that they like. And it's really difficult to build personal relationships, enduring relationships with people that you've never actually, pressed the flesh and sort of looked into their eyes, 1 meter apart. It's just very hard. Call me old school, but I really think that is what is ultimately going to be the driver. It's not a question anymore of not being able to supervise your staff and ensure that they're not, moonlighting and, when they're supposed to be on the job. All of that, it's been put to one side now. Demonstrably, people can work very efficiently from home, perhaps more efficiently. It is, how do you move up the greasy pole if you don't get to meet the boss? It's as simple as that. So I think ambitious people, are going to actually elect to come into the office, whether they need to or not. It's a career progression question. And the other one, just before I sort of hand over to someone else, it's that, we're kind of coming at this from a senior management perspective, all of us. The harsh reality is that for a lot of people, you're living in some downtown garret, which is half a mile, walking distance from your office. And it's not actually that pleasant to be working from that garret 24/7. You want to escape the garret and actually be in a more convivial, we're social creatures, to hobnob with, other members of the team. And this is where I suppose real estate development really comes into the picture. It's to make that environment away from the home much more pleasant and attractive to be in. You volunteer to be there because it's just much more fun than, being stuck at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you can see, I'm working from a garret and it is extremely hot and uncomfortable. But can I perhaps tempt Brian to address a very specific question here? Has the and this is shown up in the Aon data which I presented, that companies are having to think about reskilling certain of their employees to make sure they can actually work successfully from home. In your experience, has the pandemic exposed a shortfall in people's digital skills, which companies need to address if they're going to move to a more relaxed working environment?
I think at the very beginning of lockdown, there was a sort of quote that came out of, who's driving your digital processes in your company? Is it your CTO or is it COVID? And I think very much it was COVID for the beginning for a lot of people. We were very lucky. We're a sort of digitally based company from the ground up. So we could pick up our laptops and sort of everyone dispersed to working from a home environment, and we could all do the work that we needed to do. I still have reservations about how effective in certain cases that was, and it's mainly because of we work in a small open plan office. We hear everything that happens during the day. You pick up on things as people are talking about them, and you miss that certain part of the sort of the day in day out sort of just being in the office environment. There's definitely people that will require much more digital training, especially on the cyber side, because you don't even think about it. You come to work, it's actually taken care for you. So that's something you've never ever had to think about. You've never had to, you can walk out, go to lunch, leave your laptop lying on the desk and no one thinks about it, or leave your books open, leave your jotter open. Whereas obviously working at home or working from a sort of a cafe or something like that is a very different thing, and people need to think, not only just the actual technical training, but the awareness training around that. And then, everyone has obviously, got to grips pretty quickly with the likes of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Slack, etc. There's some very good communication tools out there, and people have definitely become upskilled with those. So I think there's a requirement for both, and in order to carry on this sort of hybrid work environment, which I think most people are keen to do, it's also looking at you were talking about how you set your office up, and perhaps it's not about juice bars and yoga mats, but it's about, okay, come to the office, because the days you're in the office, you're actually having meetings with people where you're engaged all day with them, and that gets the most out of your time while you're at the office. But if you're just sitting, writing something, then there's no point in coming to the office just to sit and write something and not engage with other people. So it's trying to maybe sort of become better time managers of our week and sort of say, okay, you know, the 2 or 3 days I'm in the office, I'm actually going to back-to-back meeting with people, but I want to be able to take that information away and work on it when I'm on my own at home. So it's, you know, I think it's time learning better time management and better use of the offices. So, you know, set up differently for you know, 2-person meetings, for 10-person meetings, for 20-person training meetings, etc., rather than just a row of desks where everyone just comes in.
More meeting rooms. Yeah. Now we've had some questions from the audience. First one is, would you say the amount of flexible working is dependent on the industry you're in, e.g. tech industry having higher flexible working culture versus financial services? I think we've answered that definitively. I think the answer is yes. I hope you agree with that, Sam. I think you said so, in fact, the difference in California and the East Coast. Second question, are we on a path to a 4-day working week and part-time jobs with employees taking on 2 to 3 jobs to make up their income shortfalls? That sounds a rather sort of dystopian image of home working to me.
I think Iceland
what do we think of that?
Iceland just done a thing on working 4 days a week that seemed to actually prove quite effective, going from 40 hours to 35, but pushing those 35 hours into a 4-day week.
But what about taking on extra jobs, doing a milk round or working part-time as a postman as well, because your salary's been cut because you're not coming to the office 5 days a week?
They're still talking about remaining on roughly the same salary because you're only losing, you know, 5 hours, and I don't know whether people need to take on part-time jobs for that.
Now here's an interesting question from Keith Amos. How are people performance managed and developed if they're working remotely? Won't that be something firms have to work out how to do? Because as Shravan was saying, you're out of sight, you're out of mind, you don't get the promotions, you don't get the career advancement. Frank, what do you think of that? What's your answer to that?
Well, I have some firsthand experience with this. You know, my time at Cushman, I always worked from my home office, always worked remote. And part of the Cushman, this was to Brian's point, right, and to Sharon's point, part of that corporate culture was where the headquarters was, either New York when it was before the DTZ merger, or in Chicago afterwards. So that was always a challenge for me, even though our technology at Cushman was digital first. And so it was seamless. The pandemic and transition to virtual collaboration was seamless for the technology teams. It wasn't as seamless for some of the other job functions. So certainly, I think that politics is a really important point in you know, in that location decision.
Mm-hmm. Now, another question here. Would working from home improve meritocratic promotions and opportunities? This is an optimist here. Would working from home improve meritocratic promotions and opportunities on who is best at the job and not based on office politics and cronyism? Shravan, I think you would say no to that. Frank, maybe you have a more nuanced answer. Could we actually, because there'd be some data, maybe Sam, you have a view on this, you'd have some data on what people are actually producing. Maybe it becomes less about cronyism and more about actually people's output. Is that possible?
Well, I think, you know, on the productivity, I mean, I think there are already metrics and there's already constructs that are looking at how productive people are, how productive teams are. So I think that's already in place. Mm-hmm. I think Siobhan's right about it's a behavioral issue as much as anything. So for instance, if you take a hard stance and say, I'm just not going to go to the office, I'm just going to work from home, and 90% of your team goes to the office, you're going to have one strong self-confidence about yourself to say, I'm not going to go to the office. So I think there's a lot of things that are behavioral that'll force you back to some level of the office. If you think you're missing something, if you think you're missing being with your colleagues, or you're missing the promotions, or you're missing being in front of your managers, I think that's going to be a big driver of getting back to the office as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'd like to move on a little bit and talk about what the impact of this digitization of working life, what the impact of it is on the real estate industry itself. Now, obviously, an office building is this massive, highly inflexible financial liability, and we're talking, you know, we talk about going back to the office, we're assuming that this is an asset which should actually make your workforce more productive. Certain people have that view, other people have a different view. But if you look, fairly far ahead, and Frank and Brian, I'm sure you both have views on this. Why can't real estate just be Uberized? Why can't we just have office space, where and when we need it on demand? I need to go to an office. We all need to be there. We'll meet at this place. Why does it need to be so inflexible? Frank?
Well, I think a lot of the topics we've already discussed show that this is really nuanced, right? There's not a one size fits all to this. Really, Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one in particular, because I think it is a nuanced answer.
It is, and I suppose in a way the sort of WeWork scenario was probably the first attempt at trying to create lots of WeWorks around the country that you can drop into at any point in time. I've been into a couple of them and spoken to people who've actually been tenants in them, and sometimes just wonder how much work actually used to get done into them, because they're sort of slightly more like sort of clubs or frat houses in a way. The fact that
the free beer was good.
Yeah, the free beer and that, bring your dog to work, and it's fantastic. But actually, how much work does actually get done there? I think there has to be some sort of structure in work. It would be great if you could sort of Uberize it. I mean, Uberizing is slightly, I suppose Uberizing, getting in a taxi is quite a personal thing. Going to work is more collaborative, so it's maybe you can't quite Uberize it. But I think that there's definitely, for bigger companies, I think rather than the head office, I think there's opportunity to have more regional hubs where people feel like they can go into, 1 day, 2 days a week and still be part of that big company and be part of that culture. For smaller companies, I think that's going to be a lot more difficult to have one employee in lots of different places, unless if you've been set up that way from day one and you're a distributed company. I think it works quite well. People understand what they're getting into from day one. There's obviously some structure set out from day one. The problem is what we're trying to do is we're trying to go from far left field to far right field of everyone's been in the office 5 days a week, working 7:30 till 10 o'clock at night to show how good you are and staying around till the boss goes, to now going, actually, we're going to move you all the way over here. You can all work from home. So, in theory, we've got to rewrite everyone's work contracts because their work contracts aren't right. So there's a huge HR issue that sits around that as well. But there's definitely offices won't just become landlords and tenants. I think you maybe need to think of offices now as hotels. So a hotel is a building. You then brand a building with a brand, Hilton or it's so long as I've actually been in a hotel, I can't think of a brand name now of a hotel, but Hilton or something like that. And then you have the occupiers who come in and actually know wherever they go in the world, they're going to get the same type of service from Hilton. So, it's becoming, space as a service or office as a service, office space as a service. It's becoming a very thrown around term now. So I think there's an opportunity for that, but we're probably a little way off that yet.
Yeah, I think, Brian, it has institutionalized itself on the margins, right? So space as a service for large corporates in the flex requirements, do they need to flex up and down? I certainly think space is now institutionalized there. Whether it becomes just a core footprint of a leasing strategy, well, there are other dependencies there, right? Because from an underwriting perspective, we've seen that if you have more than 15% flex space in your building, it actually can be a diminution in value. So again, I think the answer is nuanced, but I think that space as a service and the entire co-model has instantiated itself on those margins of workforce. And I think it's going to remain there. Whether it penetrates more into the fabric of a portfolio strategy, it remains to be seen.
Keith Amos asked a follow-up question. How do the panel see the future use of office space? He says that at the Aon HQ in Dedenhall Street, for example, the office was designed in pre-pandemic times, 10 people, 8 desks. So kind of hot desking was already part of the culture there. Will firms look to reconfigure this way, or will firms look at the Regus hot desking model and not be stuck with expensive real estate? This makes me think, the flexible workspace innovators, which we've touched on, the people like WeWork and Liquid Space and Regus and Convene and all these people, these kind of grew up outside the mainstream real estate industry. The mainstream industry is not just inflexible in terms of there's a big office building, but they have 25-year leases with these upward only rent reviews. I think this is a UK thing, possibly rather than a US thing. But quarterly rents payable in advance, rent reviews every 5 years, only upwards. And you've got these new entities offering much shorter leases, much more flexible space. They grew up outside the real estate industry. So how good is the real estate industry as it's grown up going to be actually innovating if some of the changes which we've talked about this afternoon become permanent? They're going to have to change the way they do things. Are they not? Shravan, perhaps you could, as a relative outsider to the industry, perhaps you could give us a flavor of that. And I'm sure Frank and Sam, from your data, will have some views on this as well.
Well, a couple of thoughts are firstly that the Regis model and the WeWork model were shot to prominence way before COVID. So the trend was clearly already there. And I think the other trend is these sort of large blue chip corporate juggernauts are now on the decline, arguably. Amazon and a few others are exceptions. And an entrepreneurial culture is in the ascendancy. And I think the WeWork Regis model, the Uberization of offices, is something which works particularly well with an entrepreneurial mindset. The other thing which it occurs to me is that clearly this work from home, technology-based work environment has engendered a much flatter, more meritocratic and performance-based culture. And we've kind of moved away. Again, this is part of a trend, and it's just accelerated a trend that was already in place. And these, soft skills that we were all taught were of pivotal importance to success in any corporate environment. Your face has to fit, you need to hobnob network and all of that. It seems like it's moving away from that more subjective sort of assessment to a performance-based meritocratic assessment. And so I think what is likely to happen is that there will be an Uberization of office space. Office spaces will have to be a lot more welcoming to attract people away from the home to want to be there. And we might move away from the old open plan to more open space, because of course, open plan is just a sort of breeding ground for pandemics. But open space is something which makes people feel safe, comfortable, and something perhaps that they don't have at home. So, again, I don't think there's any perfect answer. The likelihood is that we're always going to be on a continuum, and depending on your personal circumstances, depending on your personal preferences, and depending on your role, you will either work more or less from home.
Sam, can I put this question to you? Because in a slightly different way. One of the things I did in preparing for this was read this book, Where's My Office, by Chris Kane, who used to run real estate for Disney and the BBC. One of the points he makes in this book is the priorities of the real estate industry always seem to be in these big site deals, these iconic buildings, like the one Keith referred to in Leadenhall Street, innovative construction techniques, lots of glass and lots of metal, creating an asset for investors and for developers, but not actually meeting the demands of the customers, the people who actually live and work in these buildings, the tenants. That's what WeWork and Liquid Space and Regis have addressed. They're actually working for the customers of these buildings, not actually the people who run them up. Is Chris Kane's criticism of the industry a reasonable one, Sam?
Well, yeah, from having worked in real estate for a little bit, I would say that it's not as customer driven as you think of other industries. And I think the tenant seems to be, at least in the past, seems to be the last person asked, how do they really want to structure buildings, and how do they really see their workforce, and how do they see the workplace? And I think this is one thing that's coming out of the pandemic. I think the landlords and the developers are maybe forced to really understand, what do companies really want? So for instance, the company we have clients that are occupiers, and we have clients that are investors. And the first thing the investors say is, hey, introduce me to more occupiers. I really want to know what they're thinking and how we need to evolve our thinking. So I think this is actually a fair criticism by Chris. And I think, understanding customers and their needs are really going to be important. And right now it's evolving. So I don't think there's a one fit for all. It's more of an evolving discussion and topic of what does the workplace look differently? What does it look like in the future? Now, one thing we've seen is clients, workplace strategists used to say 150 square feet. This is US, 150 square feet per desk and per person. And now they're saying it's probably going to be more like 300 or 350 square feet per person. So particularly giving people more space. So this is the idea that all real estate offices are going to shut down and people aren't going to use the offices. Actually, when you talk to LinkedIn, Zoom, and others, they say, our real estate footprint might shrink by 10 or 20%. And that's due to they have to provide much more space per person or per team.
Mm-hmm. Frank, you must have a perspective on this question. Has the real estate industry had its priorities wrong and needs to change to be more customer focused now?
I think they're going to be forced to, right? And I think in two areas, Dominic. One of the most fascinating developments I think we've seen in the last couple of weeks is Dropbox announcements of Dropbox Studio, right? So the model of productivity from anywhere and a distributed workforce, I think, is being forced outside of the CRE industry, right? So as usual, we're going to be disrupted by external providers and solutions that see an opportunity in that space. On the issue of have the focus of developers and investors ignored the occupants, I think that, again, no longer can be. I personally think that tenant experience has become a primary driver in consideration for value in commercial real estate. I think that was evidenced pre-pandemic in the multi-res, multifamily space, where the hotelization, the amenities, it was providing community connection, a sense of connectivity, access to amenities. That was no longer just nice to have. It was actually driving rent premiums and ancillary revenue. I think we saw that dovetail into the office space, where now the sense of experience expanded even into IWMS and building automation systems and comfort, right? So I think pre-pandemic, we saw a movement from the nice to haves and the experience and amenities to must haves. So now I actually think they're table stakes, and I think developers, owners, investors are going to need to pay attention to what is the definition of experience and things like experience per square foot, and how is that going to bear on their development decisions.
Thanks, Frank. We're into our last 10 minutes now, so I'd like to just touch on before we close on the investing and financing side of the industry. I had a look at the data for the UK anyway, and Savills report, and it said that West End and City office yields have actually pretty much unchanged since the September 2019, before the pandemic hit, and the warehouse and distribution center yields are down. That's kind of what you'd expect. Amazon style distribution centers probably done very well in this space because people are shopping from home, and not many people are going to the office, but the yields have been stable. Now, Brian, we've talked a bit about the need for the industry to move towards shorter leases, more flexible lease terms. That inevitably makes financing harder because it makes the rental flows less predictable. Are you seeing that impact starting to hit already, or is it too soon to say, or is it just very nuanced and varies between types of buildings and types of geographies?
I think it's maybe still a little bit too early. I mean, again, there's, the commercial, it covers a sort of wide remit of asset classes, where, definitely where people are on warehouses, logistics, supermarkets, there is still a huge amount of capital looking to get deployed into that sector, both as debt and as equity. And pre-pandemic, there was already quite a bit of dry powder across both the equity and the debt markets that was waiting to be deployed. And then the pandemic hit, and everyone thought there was going to be this sort of super crash, which hasn't really happened. So again, people are starting to get into that market, and as I think Sam was saying, that there's in the States there's been a sort of contrarian view of people going in and buying office space again. So there's definitely people making moves, and whether that's buying office space to go and redevelop into residential or not. The bit we're quite lucky. The sort of properties that we transact on are sort of sub 5 million. So a lot of them have actually just managed to sort of weather the storm. They sort of trade through the cycle rather than being sort of massively affected by the cycle. But yes, a lot of banks did pull out and just stopped lending, worried about their existing loan book, what their existing loan book would look like. But there's definitely a sort of increase in both in the UK. I mean, Rightmove keep on putting out figures saying that the searches for commercial property on Rightmove have gone through the roof. So it's whether it's people looking for different types of commercial, they've moved out of one and looking to move into another, or whether they're just looking to buy and do something with it because they think there's now, with the planning laws changing over here, they think there's a better chance of getting conversion and converting that into something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I did notice the S&P 500 real estate index actually above its level in February 2020, when the first phase of the pandemic hit. But different in the UK, the FTSE 350 real estate companies are actually below that level still. But is there scope here? And Frank, I'm sure you have a view on this. Is there scope to actually start? Is the commercial real estate industry starting to think about how it can become more efficient? Digitizing data, starting to share documents through blockchains, linking up databases, putting an end to all this manual processing, and maybe even thinking about how many people, this huge chain of intermediation which seems to characterize the industry, is the commercial real estate industry starting to think about a more efficient, more technological future?
Yeah, and I think that was the case before the pandemic, Dominic, because certainly other industries were looking at how to optimize. Right. So what is your best way to improve your margin? It's optimizing your processes, right? So there's lots of tools. You mentioned some of the automated workflow. And when we talk about leasing, we have solutions like VTS that have evidenced the value of a central data model, collaboration, and automated workflow. But we have other tools like robotic process automation, right, that are being deployed back office to help some of the supporting CRE functions. So I think CRE was focused on optimizing. Part of that was a reduction in fees. Right? If you look at the valuation space and fee compression, that's obviously been a driver for how you become more efficient with data and with process. So I think pre-pandemic it was growing. I think the need now to optimize your business processes is more glaring than ever.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're lucky in the States. I think you have a better and have historically had better data to work from, both on just general CRE data and on loan data. Whereas the UK, whilst we've got the land registry and things like that, we don't have the depth of data that you guys have had for a long time. And the prop tech industry is coming very quickly. It's progressing very quickly, and there's some very interesting things coming from it. But absolutely, in the States, you've had a lot better data for a lot longer, and that's probably why you're able to.
That's a key ingredient to optimizing, right? Because you can optimize through process improvement and process automation, but you also need the data to inform each step of the contextual journey, right? So you're absolutely right, and I think the U.S. is seeing a boon with providers like Cherry and Enodo and Reonomy that are actually using machine learning, knowledge graph applications to actually present better data on markets, on assets and owners.
Mm-hmm. Now we're into our last couple of minutes, but here's a question from a member of the audience. Quite an interesting one, I think. How much of unused office building in the UK is being converted to meet the demands for residential housing? Shravan, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that. It's actually quite an interesting measure of what's really going on in terms of confidence in the future of commercial real estate, if a lot of stuff is being turned over to residential in city centres.
Well, COVID has clearly had a profound negative impact on the high street. So that is an area which is ripe for redeployment from retail to residential. And we're already seeing that.
Shopping centres too?
Say again?
Shopping centres as well. It's been disastrous for.
Absolutely. Retail in general, similarly, hospitality, travel and leisure, these are sectors that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And to that extent, clearly real estate is a relatively illiquid investment class. And, you can't, the only way that, you can't knock buildings down and rebuild them. That's incredibly expensive to do. So the best that you can do is to try to efficiently have change of use. There is, as it's been mentioned, a chronic housing shortage in the UK, the US, and everywhere, and in particular affordable housing. And so my sense is that with government support, a lot of retail and commercial real estate is getting redeployed in that direction. It's just supply and demand.
Right, so it's retail rather than office space, which is getting turned over for residential. Then you mentioned the word liquidity. Just very quickly, do you have a view on whether tokenization? It's tokenizing buildings is often put forward as an answer to that problem. We've certainly discussed it at previous Future of Finance webinars. Do you see that as a way forward, a new form of financing?
Absolutely. As an investor in general, in my other life, you look at the risk reward trade-off in any investment decision, and clearly the riskiness of commercial real estate investing is going up and up, spawned by the pandemic, and the rewards are either flat or declining. So that's not very attractive. The other is that it's the value versus growth, and the growth prospects for commercial real estate are questionable. So again, that's another strike. And the third, to your point, Dominic, is liquidity, because the biggest black mark against real estate investing has been that you have to look at a sort of a minimum 5-year time frame, because it's transaction costs are very high and they are intrinsically illiquid investments. Therefore, anything that liquefies these intrinsically illiquid investments are extremely welcome. And I think that's where technology can play a huge role by tokenizing real estate investing, residential as well as commercial, retail, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, that's exactly what we do. We basically tokenize real estate debt and have a primary market and a secondary market that allows investors to get in and out without ever physically owning a property and benefit from income off the back of commercial real estate.
So we're out of time now, but I'd like to wrap this up by just asking each of you a very broad question, and tokenization is a good segue into it. Would you describe the modern commercial real estate industry as a digital industry or analog industry? It's analog in the sense it's bricks and mortar, it's metal and glass, but is it actually digitizing from an investing and a financing and an operational point of view? Frank, you're at the heart of that question.
I think absolutely.
What's going on?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think we saw early entry in the institutional segment. So where you had firms like Berkadia, for example, right, that have such large transaction volume that adopting technology is an enabler to help with that, with underwriting, for example, with Berkadia and Red IQ, right? That was where we saw the first entry. Those efficiencies and enablers are coming downstream. So I think we're seeing them be deployed across mid-market brokerages, other servicers. So I think CRE has not only arrived, but it's actually penetrating all the way downstream.
Thanks, Frank. Brian, what's your view, analog or digital, or in transition from one to the other?
I think we're probably in the UK. We're definitely more analog. I think we're on a journey, which is a great place to be at the moment, and it's becoming much more digitized, and the opportunities that are available in digitizing it are just massive. Which I'm really excited to be in this part of the industry at the moment, because I don't think there's ever been this many, apart from the days when it was land grabbing time, when you were physically grabbing the underlying land. I think this is grabbing the digitization age now. I think this is the sort of comparison you can make there.
Shravan, are you working in the digital industry?
Well,
no.
My background, as you know, Dominic, is residential real estate investing, and my sense is that
there are prop techs in that sector too.
98% of home searches begin online. So the three main portals in the UK, Zoopla, Rightmove, and Prime Location, is where everyone looks today before they visit their local estate agent. So arguably, the analog model, the old analog model with a high street presence, is either dead or dying. And the Zoopla model is the new normal.
Yeah, I did a very interesting interview the other day with a firm called Cogit, who are looking to digitize the conveyancing process. It's on our website. Have a look. Sam, a last word from you. You're looking at the data every day, and from a US perspective at least, is real estate finally becoming, despite its analog origins and its clearly palpable analog character, is it becoming a digitized industry from the point of view of data, from the point of view of operations, from the point of view of liquidity? Is it a digital industry?
Yeah, so to use a baseball term, I would say we're in the first inning. I've been so surprised over the years of the lack of data and the real deepness and machine learning outputs that real estate firms don't use. And I see, this idea of how to maybe start using data in a way that could drive different decisions. So if you think about it from point of view of a lot of investors that use the same data that everybody else uses, and I think they're starting to ask themselves what different types of data could drive different outcomes that we might drive different decisions. So I think it feels like we're kind of in the first inning, maybe going to the second inning as we transition to more of a digital data-driven culture and using that data to come up with different ideas.
Mm-hmm. Sadly, I think we must wrap it up there. That's all we have time for. I'd like to thank our panelists, Brian Bartleby from Plotlen, Sam Hocking from Virtus AI, Shravan Sood from Global Alpha, and Frank Spadafora from CRE Tech. Future of Finance, our next webinar is next week, Wednesday, 21st of July at our usual time of 2 o'clock London time. In it, we're going to revisit the fast-moving theme of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, in company with the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve. And I hope that lots of you will join us then. But for now, it's goodbye from the six of us.